Hey guys, it's Chandler, and welcome to the Healing Heroes.
I promise you.
I'm Chandler Stroud, an executive, wife, and busy mom of two, who after years of living with anxiety, health struggles, and an unshakable feeling like I should be happier, made a profound discovery that changed everything. Join me on a journey where unexpected paths lead to healing and more happiness. On this show, we'll explore unconventional ways to unlock more joy in your own life with the help of my very own healers and trusted advisors, the Healing Heroes. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show, and thank you so much for tuning in. I am very happy you are back with us because hero and psychotherapist Jen Baumgold is back. And once again, we are focusing on a topic that impacts nearly everyone in some way, shape, or form. But this theme in particular is especially close to my heart because I believe so deeply that pretty much all women have experienced it at some point in their lives and may not realize how it's impacting the way they interact and show up in the present. And that's small t trauma. In the pilot episode of this show, I talk about my own experiences with both big T and small t trauma and what we mean by those terms. We'll get into that and so much more today with Jen, but at the highest level, the key difference lies in the intensity and in the impact of the experience. Big T trauma is essentially what you'd expect, those major, life-threatening, or deeply distressing events like abuse, natural disasters, war, loss of a loved one, severe accidents, and lots more. The small t traumas are those experiences that, while may not seem as significant on the surface, you internalize them, and they often accumulate or build, shaping beliefs, behaviors, or emotional patterns. Things like ongoing criticism or emotional neglect in childhood, feeling rejected, bullied, or unworthy in some way, financial difficulties, and the list goes on, would be examples potentially of small t traumas. Both are important and leave an impact, but often we overlook the small t traumas thinking they didn't have as much of an effect on us or that we've moved past them. I'm here to tell you that often that is not the case and has been my experience from the start of this healing journey. Doing that work to identify these moments and reframe them for yourself can be an incredibly effective way to feel happier and healthier in your present day. So much to discuss today. But before we dive in, let me introduce Jen for anyone new here. She's a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist specializing in the treatment of trauma. Jen is certified in EMDR and began her career at the New York City Fire Department Counseling Service Unit, where she worked until 2016. During her time there, she provided crucial mental health support to FDNY members and their families. In addition to her private practice, Jen is an active member of the Fairfield County Trauma Response Team, a volunteer alliance of mental health professionals committed to aiding first responders and the local community in healing from trauma, tragedy, and stress. Please join me in welcoming Jen back to the show. We are so happy you're back with us, Jen.
I'm so glad to be back, Chandler.
Thank you for coming and for your willingness to talk about such a big topic. I know this one's a little bit harder to get our arms around, but we have, 45 minutes to really dig in and help people understand what these experiences might look like and how they might be showing up so that they can get curious and start asking some of these tough questions for themselves. Before we jump into today's topic, do you want to briefly overview the purpose of therapy and specifically EMDR for any new listeners who may have missed our last conversations together?
Sure. I think therapy is something different to every person. And pretty much probably if you're listening to this podcast, you're somewhat familiar with therapy. EMDR might be a little less familiar to most people. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And it's a form of treatment specifically targeted to trauma and traumatic experiences and trauma response that uses eye movements in the form of bilateral stimulation, which is a lot of words to essentially say moving your eyes back and forth from left to right to help you process things that you might not normally be able to access in that kind of relaxed state normally in regular talk therapy.
Love that definition. Thank you for just offering a quick overview for new listeners. I think, obviously, I always like having you describe EMDR because it's such a big part of all of the conversations we have here and has been so effective in allowing me to go back and access a lot of those memories and reprocess them with you. So I'm a huge believer in the therapy myself and always love making sure people know that it's available to them as well if there's anything that they feel like they want to talk about with a therapist, specialized in that treatment, of course. Jen, though I gave a brief description in the intro, I'd love to hear how you define small T trauma and how it differs from big T trauma.
I was thinking when you gave the description that you did describe it really well. The few things that I would add to that is I think that small T trauma often threatens our social connection, right? It's not where we think of big T trauma as a threat to our health, to our safety, to our lives. Small T trauma threatens our connections and our social connections. Not always, it can be, but I tend to think it circles around that. And that's why it doesn't feel as life threatening, but, it can be just as impactful, if not more, than big T traumas.
I love that explanation because it's so easy to grasp and understand. I mean, I've never really thought about it from the lens of a basic human need, which is connecting and to some degree being accepted by the tribe. And that small T trauma really focuses us on those types of relationships versus the one that you necessarily have with yourself, if that makes sense.
Or your very existence. I think if we look at it at a, purely existential standpoint, whether it's, evolutionary or not, big trauma threatens our lives. Usually, I think that's like the actual definition in the DSM-5 is that it involves a threat to your life or perceived threat to your life. Whereas I think of little T trauma as more of a social threat. So a threat to the disconnection from your tribe, which evolutionarily is just as important because if you think back to how we're designed, if you lost your tribe, you'd lose your life and that was it. So it does feel like that and it can mimic that. It just pertains sometimes to more social situations. I think the things that you described, if you look at them, if you think about, being excluded from a friend group, if you think about divorce, if you think about, financial difficulties, all those things threaten our connection to our tribe, right? So, or to our loved ones. And that can feel like a real existential threat and therefore produce the same sort of trauma response that big T traumas can.
Why do you think small T traumas are often overlooked or minimized, knowing that they are rooted in social connections, which are so important for thriving and happiness and feeling safe in your day-to-day?
I think, part of our natural response to trauma is avoidance. It's one of the defenses we use against it. So you'll hear somebody who's undergone a pretty significant, even big T trauma, question whether that really happened to them, or they may experience something like depersonalization or, a separation from themselves. In little T traumas, we tend to do that by rationalizing it, saying that, okay, this isn't a big deal. It's happened to everybody, so what if I lost my job? So many people have lost their jobs before me. And so why am I reacting to it this way? It's constantly minimized. And I think that's a way of trying to cope with the feelings and make it better. But it can actually make it worse in that it kind of compounds shame on top of something traumatic that's happened to us. So we're not only feeling that response to the little T trauma, but we're also berating ourselves and shaming ourselves, which is going to lead us to maybe not talk about it so much. To keep it secret and, kind of grows on itself at that point.
Do you think shame is the most common reaction, or should I say like the most common emotion associated with small T traumas?
I think it can be shame. It can be, various forms of humiliation, embarrassment. A lot of times it can be feelings of loneliness. No one else really understands this, even though maybe so many people have gone through it. They aren't reacting the way that I have. So therefore there's something wrong with me, which I guess leads back to shame. So they're all sort of interrelated. But I would say it's probably the biggest one. I'd imagine there's a lot of, sometimes there can be sadness and grief, isolation, involved with it, in that thinking that no one's going to understand why you're reacting to this in this way.
Right, right. That makes sense. How do these everyday wounds accumulate and shape our self-perception over time?
A lot of times in any kind of particular traumatic experience, we develop a negative self-belief, right? And in the little t traumas, those can be formed as well. And then they're reinforced by more little t traumas or more, of our experiences out in the world. And we have this inherent, negative cognitive bias, right? Where it evolutionarily suits us to look at things from a negative lens. We're always looking out for the dangers. So you combine that with something like a confirmation bias, and we're just looking for cues in the environment to confirm this theory that we have that we're not worthy, and then that is reflected back to us in other little t traumas and sort of compounds again onto it and accumulates into this. Well, this must be true because, in second grade, your teacher says, alludes to you being stupid, and you begin to form that negative belief about yourself. And then maybe you're, placed in the room that you have to take untied tests because you have a learning disability. And that is then interpreted as you're stupid, and no one really corrects that for you. And then something else happens, like maybe you're in fifth grade and you aren't picked first for a team. And you're like, well, it must be because I'm stupid and I'm, bad and not worthy of being loved. And it can just sort of compound on top of itself into this negative belief that's being reinforced wherever you look.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can see how that easily happens. And I think what's so fascinating about this space in particular is I don't know that it happens on a conscious level all the time.
No, it definitely doesn't. It definitely doesn't. And again, that avoidance and that rationalization kind of keeps it from being in our consciousness, right? We just feel bad and it becomes self-referencing. So it's not about something that happened to us. It's something that we created. It's something that just is who we are. So we're not even necessarily, a lot of times in therapy, people will come in with this negative self-belief, with this negative self-talk and sense of unworthiness. And at times we can use EMDR to sort of trace that back to instances that happened in their childhood. And they really don't have an idea that it's connected to that, or maybe sometimes they don't even necessarily have a conscious, working memory of it. But it's operating in their daily lives as this place where they're showing up in life as I'm not worthy, or it must be because I'm stupid or lazy, any set of negative beliefs that they've developed, and they've just owned that and never really recognized that it came from something in their environment.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've experienced that firsthand. Obviously, I knew to reach out to you because I had one of the big T traumas being abuse, but it's really been incredible what else has unfolded in our sessions together that I didn't realize I was still hanging on to outside of that big T experience. There were so many little T moments that shaped my beliefs about myself and the world that I didn't even realize I was carrying. And it's been really, really impactful to unpack that with you and kind of go back and reframe it and try and plant new beliefs that I can cultivate more intentionally in my present day. So I've really, really seen a lot of progress and benefit in doing the work on a lot of these small T traumas.
And a lot of that work too involves going back to your point and understanding it from an adult perspective, right? Not all little T traumas happen in childhood, but when they do, we understand that from the child perspective. And there is no other sense of well, maybe this person was picking on me because they were unhappy in their own life. Or maybe, my mom or dad was having a hard time in their personal life and they weren't paying attention to me because of that. It's all self-referencing when we're children because we don't know anything different. So being able to examine that from an adult perspective allows us to see that, it's not us being unworthy that caused this to happen. And, just like we do with regular quote unquote big T traumas, we can reprocess it to understand it differently and keep it in the past so it's not coming up in our future or in our present.
How do you think these experiences affect self-worth, relationships, and our own emotional well-being?
I think if you think you're unworthy, you're going to show up to situations not, demanding or asking for the things that you deserve. And then when you don't get them, it's like, well, I see, again, that confirmation bias. I wasn't worthy of this. So of course this boyfriend didn't show up for me, or of course this friend won't make plans with me because there's something wrong with me. And the little T traumas can reinforce that. And I think in relationships, if we have some kind of attachment trauma, if somebody who was supposed to show up for us didn't. And again, trauma's also not about just what happened to you. It's about what was supposed to happen to you and didn't, right? Like what you were supposed to get, the basics to meet your attachment needs. And when that hasn't happened, we then form, a perception that we're not worthy of having that attachment need met. So when your partner does something that might be neutral, you may interpret it as them not showing up for you, right? I mean, we always say in therapy, it's not about the dishes. Everyone fights about the dishes, but a partner who doesn't do the dishes may just think they don't want to do the dishes, but somebody who was neglected and their needs weren't met might think, oh, see, I'm not worthy of doing the dishes for. So I think you can show up to your relationships and interpreting things as different than they're intended. And whether that be with a partner, a friend, sort of distorting things that people might say, reading emotions of others to be about you. I think those are all things that can impact relationships that can come from trauma.
Do you think, just taking it a step further, are there specific patterns or behaviors that might indicate someone is carrying unresolved small t trauma?
It makes me think when there's something you're reacting to in the present moment that feels like an outsized reaction, right? So it's hard to really distinguish that. But, the example I always use is if your boss gives you feedback and it's not like objectively harsh criticism, but it's feedback. It's maybe negative in nature or critical, and you're reacting to it in this, like, from the sense of your body, like it's very destructive to you. You're functioning emotionally, but it's just, you can't separate from it. Anything that, like, somebody in your life that, may say something a certain way, and you can objectively look at it and say, okay, well, like, I can understand how they didn't mean it that way. But there's a bodily reaction to it, and you like think about it a lot, or you tend to ruminate on it. So it feels like it's just, and maybe not outsized reaction. That can be the case sometimes, but that the reaction is not in line with what's actually going on. So then there might be something underneath that's being triggered.
I mean, I think that's a very clear way to think about it. In any scenario you might be in, is my response matching the stimuli?
Exactly. Is my response matching the stimuli? And I think it's not, it doesn't have to necessarily be a pattern. It can be just, but you might see it as a pattern, and you might just see it, randomly, and be like, I don't know why I'm reacting to that this way. Like, what's going on with that for me?
What are some common coping mechanisms that either you've seen with your clients or that generally people might develop as a result of small t trauma?
Well, again, it's the rationalization and the dismissal, right? Like, this can't be traumatic. I'm overreacting. So that can turn into any number of emotional responses. I think it can be deflected as anger. It can, come out in negative self-talk where you're berating yourself for it. You may overcompensate in certain areas to try and prove your self-worth because of it.
That's an interesting one. So when you say overcompensate in certain areas to prove your self-worth, would like people pleasing be an example of that maybe?
Oh yeah. I think people pleasing, overachieving, if you're the kid who was told that you weren't very smart or that you weren't paying attention, when you were younger, berated for not having good grades or felt, and then you go on to try and prove yourself to everyone else, you're going to be an overachiever. You might try to overachieve to get that sense of like, that part of me is not true. That, traumatic thing that happened when I was little, that person was wrong. I keep going back to teachers because I think that these things happen a lot in school where And again, understanding it from that adult perspective can be so important, because when we're little, teachers are everything. Teachers and parents are everything. And everything they say and do goes in on such a really important level. Like, we take it as Bible that the teacher said this, and we don't think to, question it. And as we get older, we realize that teachers and parents are people too, and they have all their, tons of stuff going on in their lives that might be impacting the way that they're reacting or acting. We don't see that as a child. So a teacher might say something to a kid, like that they take as I'm stupid, and then that's reinforced again and again. And that child who becomes an adult deathly afraid of being the stupid kid that the teacher thought they were.
Yeah. I mean, I have my own story with this because we spent more sessions working through a fifth grade memory than we may have even the abuse. I mean, it's unbelievable how this one incident in fifth grade stuck with me. And I would have told you I was past it, that it didn't hold any weight in how I'm showing up today. But it's just so funny how we come back to these anchor memories that shape our beliefs. And to your point, I really feel what you're saying about parents and teachers believing what they say to be Bible growing up. I mean, you really look to them as your guides and to understand what's right and wrong at that age. And I actually don't know if I've told the story before on the show, but at the highest level, my fifth grade experience was I had been on crutches for many months, having hurt my ankle. And I had been in crutches for so long because of this terrible sprained ankle that some of the kids had started to question whether I really needed the crutches and were second guessing whether I had switched legs and was on the crutches to get attention. And my fifth grade teacher kept me after recess one day and approached me and said, I hear that some of the other kids are saying you switched ankles and you have been on crutches a really long time. So I'm going to need a doctor's note to prove that you're not faking it. And I mean, when I say that my trust in teachers and, just understanding that this system was here to advocate for me and that my teachers were this safe space, I mean, that all just imploded in one conversation. And I felt anger. I felt hurt. I felt not seen and misunderstood. And then I started second guessing myself. Did I switch ankles? I don't know. And of course I hadn't, right? But so many emotions in that one moment. And it really was a pivotal experience for me in how I saw myself in the world, how I saw adults and their ability to do the right thing and take care of me. It's really fascinating. No, my life was not threatened, but my nervous system responded to that experience just as intensely as it had some of the much scarier experiences that I had felt at home.
Absolutely. And thinking about that, the trust that you put in a teacher, the trust that a child puts in a teacher, they're the adults. They're supposed to be in charge and know what's right. So like you said, you began to doubt yourself because you could be wrong, but there's no way he's wrong because he's the teacher. And so if you're going to believe in yourself and, whether you're right or wrong or the teacher, you're going to go with the teacher, because if the teacher's wrong, then you're screwed, right? They're the ones who are in charge. They're the ones who are running the show, the adults in general, the trusted adults, the teachers, the parents. So we're going to believe them over ourselves. And then that starts to instill a sense of self-doubt and disconnection from oneself. Okay. Like you said, was I really? I mean, you knew you weren't faking it, but there was a moment when you actually questioned that, because this person, of authority, yes, but also of attachment, right? This person who is supposed to be taking care of you and who's supposed to know everything was asking this. Not a peer, not somebody, not another kid where you can say, no, you don't know what you're talking about. He's supposed to know what he's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, he is. He is. And you're right. It's really incredible how it stays with you. I mean, even to this day, I'm constantly trying to reinforce, I trust myself. I trust myself. That is something I am still learning every day.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure a lot of memories contributed to that belief, but that was a big one. That was a big one for me.
I think a lot of times people feel that if you have a little T trauma or you feel that something's traumatic, that maybe other people don't see as traumatic, you think you're making excuses or blaming someone else for issues. And that's not really what this work is about. It's more about understanding it, because you're not blaming the teacher, right? You're not saying like, he's the reason this happened. It's what happened in your interpretation of it and how it went into your memory and nervous system, and trying to rewire that and create a new perspective and a new belief. So, that's something that I do hear from people sometimes is, well, I don't want to blame other people for my problems, or, this is my issue. And that's not what we're saying, right? Like, that's not, it's about understanding and correcting and healing from it, not just saying, well, my teacher was mean to me, so that's why I, can't get a job, or I'm hard on myself, or whatever it is,
Absolutely.
that somebody draws from that. Like, that, it's not that simple. It's just sort of understanding how you interpreted the experiences around you. I think other people can say that to people too, say, oh, that's not a big deal. Why are you so upset about that? You have to own your own issues. That you can't go on blaming your parents for everything. These are things that I've heard, right? And nobody's trying to blame anyone's parents or teachers or anyone. We're all doing the best that we can, but it's understanding that and understanding how it was interpreted and the beliefs that came from that and the reaction that you had to that, and reworking it.
It's such an important distinction to make for listeners, and it's important work to do, because it's about getting curious about yourself and, again, understanding those experiences through a new perspective that helps you grow and change what you want to change in the present. So I think it's really important.
And I think, if I remember correctly, that memory came about from something that happened in the present, where we were just talking about like that outsized, or the reaction not really quite matching the stimulus. I think it was something that happened at work. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, it was a conversation with my old boss, corporate setting. My reaction didn't match the stimulus. And why do I feel physically shifted as a result of this conversation?
Like threatened, yeah.
Threatened. I've lost, not my composure. It's not that I started screaming or crying or anything, but like, I felt such a visceral and physical reaction to the conversation in that moment that I knew there was something more underneath. And that's where we started. And it went back to that 5th grade moment.
Yeah. Which, again, like, if you think about it, okay, yeah, but you said did not involve, any kind of physical threat to you, but it did involve social threat to, okay, not only like the social threat of, okay, if the teacher doesn't believe me, then I'm really, in trouble with the kids. Like, no one's going to accept me, but also that disconnection from yourself and that belief that you knew what was right. And it challenged that and your sense of, just your gut feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really did. It really did. It's had a lasting effect, but it is possible to heal those experiences and wounds, as we do so often in your office. And I'm really so grateful. But I'm curious, on the heels of that conversation, and we touched on this a little bit, can small T traumas be as impactful as big T traumas in shaping a person's nervous system and responses? And if so, how does someone who spent years dismissing their experiences as not a big deal start giving themselves permission to heal?
I think absolutely, yes. Small T traumas can be just as impactful as big T traumas. And sometimes in different ways, they can be more impactful, right? Because they're so layered and they accumulate. And it really kind of depends on the individual's background, what they've experienced before, what their, support network is like, what their, attachment needs have been met or not met. So somebody could, experience a small T trauma. Take, for example, like a narcissistic mother, right? Like, which doesn't seem like a small T, but I guess if we're talking categorically would be. But if, one person has a narcissistic mother and they're isolated and they're an only child and their father just co-signs their mother's behavior or is abusive and neglectful or just checked out, but another person has a narcissistic mother and their father's very involved. And I hate to beat up on moms here, but I'm just using an example off the top of my head. But their father's very involved and is very supportive, or their other parent is very, or another adult in their life is, whether it be a teacher, a coach, a family friend, a sibling, is incredibly supportive and makes that person feel worthy and not alone. The impact of the narcissistic mother is going to have less of an effect on them. So it really varies by the individual how any trauma impacts somebody. We all come with our own baggage, so to speak, or our own history and our own personal history, our own cultural history, our own genetic history. And so all these things, if you look at, combat veterans, they can experience the same thing in a war, and one will develop PTSD and one won't. So what might be traumatic to you, big T or little t, may or may not be to me, and vice versa. So I think we have to really kind of think about the individual person in that.
I'm curious, like taking this even further, how does someone who spent years dismissing their experiences as not a big deal start giving themselves permission to heal?
That's a really good question. I think it, like all the other work, it's layered, and it's undoing that notion that they don't deserve to heal, maybe, or that it's, that denial of it. It's really, I think some of it involves getting in touch with, some of the other modalities we've talked about for trauma, really being present in your body, knowing that, okay, like I can say one thing, but if my body feels another, it's not lying to me. So kind of dropping into that and understanding why you're reacting to something, and working from that standpoint of self-compassion and understanding that maybe didn't get what you needed in those situations, but that doesn't mean you weren't deserving of it. And I think EMDR is helpful in that, and sort of peeling back the layers of it. We did an episode on EMDR resourcing. I think that's always helpful. And just as, a quick refresher, resourcing from an EMDR perspective is identifying people, places, things, moments in your life that you did feel like your nervous system was calm, connected, online, and really kind of drawing those out. And it takes a lot because, again, because of that negative cognitive bias that we all have, we have to really search out those positive experiences and savor them, and I think that can help with kind of reversing the effects of little t trauma, in that, okay, sometimes clients will say it to me, like, I don't have those experiences. I really can't think of a time when I felt loved and appreciated and seen, and we try, and even if we find one that's just a little tiny second, like, okay, my daughter hugged me today and I felt that, we'll just stay with that hug. Think about what it felt like in your body to feel that warmth of somebody loving you. And we just try and keep like a box around it almost. And really, like, sometimes we'll use this tappers or bilateral stimulation to draw that, to reinforce it, to make it stronger. And, that's something that I think you can do it yourself. You notice these moments, but you have to really sort of be attuned to them, and attuned to them in your body the same way we are to the negative ones of, okay, like, I feel really happy, safe, content, loved right now. Let me savor this. We are often so busy, like worried that it's not going to last, or moving on to the next thing, or how will I get this feeling back? Just be with that, and I think that can sort of, again, build upon itself. And but you have to be the same way that you said before, is some of the subconscious, the little t traumas, are we even aware of them? And yes, they are subconscious, and we're not aware of them often. So building that up takes awareness, and takes being really tuning towards it, to make sure that you can take in these experiences and kind of commit them to your nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. I think it's such a good reminder that it's not all bad. Look for those glimmers, I think they call them, right?
Yes, glimmers. That's the word that Deb Data, who does a lot of polyvagal work on the nervous system, uses. And I love that more than resources, because resources sounds kind of technical, but glimmers is, yes, just this glimmer of, love, safety, wholeness, whatever it is that may be hard to find sometimes, but when you do find it, savor it.
Such a good reminder. It is. It really is. And they really are incredibly helpful tools as you embark on an EMDR journey to really find that safety and to your point, I love that you can use them in everyday life. Like, you don't have to be in a therapist's office using your resources. You can get a felt sense of those moments, of those memories, by tapping into them in your day-to-day or whenever you feel like you need to slow down and take a breath. And it is a good reminder. Sometimes I forget they're there.
And I think we all do. We all are busy with our lives, but I think there's another notion that, if we stop and take a moment to feel this, it's going to be gone, right? Or like somehow we're going to undo it or jinx it. And I think that, sense of foreboding often prevents us from really connecting to those moments. So it can be something as little as, you see a hummingbird outside or you see a butterfly and just appreciating that beauty. It doesn't mean all your problems are solved, but it's a moment where you're just connected to yourself and to the appreciation of the beauty in the world.
Thanks for offering that. It's so accessible to anybody and is a really great place to start. Mm-hmm. What would you say to someone who recognizes themselves in this conversation but isn't sure where to start?
Like you said, recognizes themselves. That's like sort of the first sense of awareness that, okay, maybe this just isn't who I am, right? I don't have to believe the story I've been telling myself this whole time. And it starts with that. I think, if therapy is accessible to you, finding a therapist to talk to about this that you trust, somebody that you feel a connection with, that you can, you feel is safe to talk about this with, that would be my first sort of recommendation. If that's not something that's available to you, maybe journaling about it, understanding, okay, this sounds familiar. And I do have this really like persistent negative belief about myself. Writing it out and trying to find the evidence for it and the evidence against it. Oftentimes we'll surprise ourselves with how much evidence we can find against what we actually, the negative beliefs that we have. But I think really, the awareness is the first part of it, and finding that self-compassion. Would you treat somebody else this way? Anybody that would, if they had gone through this experience, would you be like, oh, well, that's not a big deal? Most people wouldn't. And oftentimes when we do that, it's really a projection of what's going on for us. So even when we are doing that to someone else, it's really not because we think that, it's because we're feeling that.
Yeah. I think that's spot on. I really do. And we talk all the time on the show about how do you show yourself self-compassion? Imagine you were talking to your niece or nephew or some other person that you love, right? We treat everyone else with such different levels of acceptance and grace than we often give ourselves. Yeah. So I think it's a really powerful reminder.
Absolutely.
Jen, thank you so much for being here. This was such a great conversation, and I know it's going to help so many of our listeners.
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be here, Chandler, and I hope that it does.
And to those tuning in, if you like today's discussion, please share it with friends and don't forget to subscribe to the show. You can also visit healingheroespodcast.com to get resources, meet the heroes, and share your ideas for future episodes. Thanks for listening, everyone. And until next time, remember, be curious, be courageous, and be kind to yourself. You've got this.